I don't want to sound negative regarding previous panels, but this is going to be the most important panel. But if we talk seriously, of course, this dimension of transatlantic relations is very important for the reasons we already mentioned, and in particular in the last panel when we were talking about the role of what sometimes is called a global south, developing countries, non-Western, and let me put it this way, non-Eastern countries, even though many of them are in the East and in the West. And part of the problem that we saw was that the West has lost a lot of soft power in recent decades, and some of the speakers in the previous panels mentioned double standards. Mentioned reputational problems of the West, not sticking to its commitments. And in this panel, we'll talk about development and development aid, development cooperation, and the role of transatlantic relationship in actually delivering on sustainable development goals, on development objectives, on the ambition regarding development aid. Even many years ago, when developed countries promised to spend 0.7% of GDP on development aid, this commitment was respected by, I think, 6 countries or 7 countries in total. But in recent years, the situation has become even more difficult, and we see that collectively, transatlantic partners are not performing very well in terms of their soft power and reputation in developing world, and also there are issues between those countries. They sometimes view the world somewhat differently. Today we have with us an excellent pair of panelists. I should say we had a last-minute cancellation, and interestingly, I mentioned that to Karen and to Joel already, we wanted to have people from multilateral development institutions, and they found that this discussion is too sensitive. And this is just an opportunity to celebrate academic freedom. We academics can say things that Joel and I, we used to work in multilateral development banks, and we know that sometimes academics have a lot more freedom to use, to exercise, and that's a great privilege. Here at Sciences Po, which was founded 150 years ago as École Libre de Sciences Politiques, the free school of political science, academic liberty has a special meaning. I'm very happy that I have 2 academics with me. Karen McCour is a chair professor at Paris School of Economics, one of the leading development economists. Certainly in this town and on this continent. She, among other things, she is a co-editor of Journal of Development Economics and a board member of JPAL and a co-founder of a very important transatlantic initiative, which is Virtual Development Seminar, VDEV, which is a weekly seminar co-organized by the 2 leading networks of development economists, those working in CPR, Center for Economic Policy Research, and those working in BRED in the US. And this is, again, an example of transatlantic cooperation, which is actually delivering on joint, on common agenda. Joel Hellman is a dean of School of Foreign Service in Georgetown. Before becoming a dean, Joel was a political scientist on faculty of Columbia. Then moved to the development bank universe, first working in the office of chief economist at EBRD, where he was in charge of political assessments and transition report. Joel has written many important papers on transition in Russia. Joel, in his political science life, specialized on that particular country. Then Joel has moved to World Bank, where he played, again, many important roles, including being head of Indonesia, but also in terms of working on research. This is something which is very dear to me. He's launched a business environment and enterprise performance survey, which is a big survey of enterprises around the world, the data that are used by many development economists around the world, myself included, and I also fundraise for additional rounds when I was chief economist of EBRD. This is a joint enterprise of EBRD and World Bank, and now it's also supported by EIB And it's great that these surveys are actually continuing, because we now have a panel of tens of thousands of observations around the world. So we agreed today to talk about main challenges of developing countries, and how Western countries view those, and how they actually act regarding these challenges. I asked my panelists to identify the issues they want to talk about, and each of them identified two. We have many more challenges, but we'll start with opening remarks on those two. 2x2 matrix. Karen suggested she would talk about issues related to the budget of development aid and issues related to refugees and climate change. These things are also non-separable. And Joel said he would talk about debt crisis and fragile states and conflicts. So as you can imagine, each of those issues is a first-order problem globally. And we live in the times where each of those issues should be considered as existential problem. And unfortunately, it's not necessarily on the dashboard of every politician in the West. But development economists are looking at those issues. And with that, I would like to give floor to Karen for opening remarks.
Thank you. And thanks for this invitation. You can hear me well? Yeah, great.
We also have people online, so it's important to use the microphone.
Wonderful. This is, for me, a somewhat unusual setting. I used to be, in my young days, an assistant professor at SAIS, the School of Advanced International Studies in DC, and so that used to be more this type of audience, I guess, than I don't do this very commonly these days. But so let me so I'm going to come from a very academic development economist perspective, and then I will in the second part link a little bit to an experience, an opportunity if I've had to see, the from close by one occasion of collaboration between, transatlantic and beyond in the delivery of global public goods. So first on the first point on the so we live in a world where, as was already mentioned, the commitments to the 0.7 are out of the door by far in most countries, and where there where there is still some attempt to pay lip service to it, it's really lip service in part because that portfolio is being used for a divergent set of issues, including aid to refugees that does not involve financial flows to the low and middle income countries. Now, so that's happening at the same time that arguably global challenges, but challenges in low and middle income countries are increasing, and we'll talk about climate change in a second. I think that the one counterbalancing factor that, as an academic economist, is a sliver of hope is that I think both in Europe and in the US, including so both in Europe and in North America, including in France and in the US, have an increasing and in the multilaterals for that matter, an increasingly sensitivity to having evaluations of development programs and policies and using the evidence coming from those evaluations for the design of new interventions and programs. And so we see that, both in the US, there's something called Development Innovation Ventures, and here in France, the Fonds d'Innovation et Développement are initiatives set within the the bilaterals, aiming to rigorously test social innovations and then scale them based on the evidence. And so it's an interesting development that has happened over the last 10 years or so, and where they also closely collaborate. Of course, they are partly building on the dynamism that came from the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2019, on impact evaluation, randomized controlled trials in particular. But it goes beyond those institutions, like clearly in the World Bank. I think these days, compared to 20 years ago, there is much more focus on evidence. The chief economist at USAID now is a micro-development economist who sees as his task not to bring more evaluation, but to say, when you come with a new intervention, show me what we've learned from the evidence that speaks to this. Now, the reason why that matters and why that's directly related to the less aid is if what we know from this evidence base, if you look program by program, we actually the the bilateral investments and the multilateral investments often have been investing in programs or interventions that have very low return. And where we see after when we look over and over and over again, whether it's microcredit, whether it's training programs, whether it's infrastructure, like school infrastructure, that when we evaluate these rigorously, we find very low returns. And so in a certain way, there's money out of the window. And so to the extent that we can replace those with kind of things that with evidence, with intervention for which we have evidence there is higher return, I think there's a little bit of hope. And I think that's where the collaboration comes in, because those are built on collaborations between academics in a certain way on both sides, of pulling that evidence together, sensitizing the evidence. And so, you mentioned CPR. So CPR is having a fantastic service of having, so building on the blogs on VoxDev, where they kind of put literature reviews online for policymakers to go and say, okay, this is what we know about this. I want to know something about vocational training programs. Well, it's out there for the policymakers to. So that's one. That's kind of the hopeful point. Now, on the less hopeful points, shifting to climate change and more in general, environmental damages. I know there was already a panel earlier today around questions on climate. I think that mostly focused on mitigation, which is natural. I think if you look at the focus from Europe and the US, when we're thinking of low and middle income countries, the challenge really is adaptation. And I think there is a common mistake that is being made by the people in the US and in Europe when dealing in the discussions about climate finance with the low and middle income countries, in mixing the mitigation and the adaptation debates. The damage is coming from the global north. The cost is being buried by the global south, and proportionally so. The contributions to the damage by the global south is minimum. You can show that, the people have shown that with data. Of course, the rainforest comes to mind. They're our last kind of savior in a certain way. But way beyond that, kind of the damages, the costs are on the increasing disasters, the weather that is unpredictable, pest diseases, etc. And so those are, and you see, I'm a microdevelopment economist. I go on the field in places like Madagascar, Congo, Haiti earlier, or Central America. This is daily life for farmers, for families, and they need to figure out how to deal with this. And so that's where climate finance is going to need to come in. Now, somehow in the US and in Europe, people think you can do both. You should insist on adaptation and mitigation at the same time. So there should be win-wins. And objectively, if you look at the evidence base, there is very few win-wins for those populations. So now, the puzzle to me, as a development economist, is that people have another way of adapting. And we know what that is. It's moving. If I live in Madagascar, if I live in Mozambique, and the typhoons hit over and over and over again, well, I'll move. And we know people are moving, and definitely we know that that's happening in Central America in a very visual way. And so and there seems to be a consensus both in Europe and in the US that you want to mitigate those streams, but that's not a very rational thing. So that's maybe rational, but it's not rational to then not invest in other types of adaptation mechanisms. So now one way that, and this is now related to my participation or my role as an external advisor to the CGR. So the CGR is the international network of International Agricultural Research Institutes. So some of you may know CIMMYT and IRRI. So those are the research centers that came up with the technologies that generated the Green Revolution, right? So massive yield increases mostly in Latin America and in Asia. So this still exists, and their mandate is to provide a global public good, which is new agriculture technologies that, today, for instance, help deal with climate adaptation or help with dealing with the deteriorating environmental health that, whether that's soil, air pollution, water pollution, etc. That's one example of an institution that provides a global public good. It's tiny. It's tiny because the investments in it is tiny. There are some investments by the bilaterals, some by the multilaterals. It's hard to think about how you design an institution that provides effectively a global public good. We'll see. I mean, the more kind of telling example, I guess, is the zoonotic diseases. If that's not a global public, if protection against zoonotic disease is not a global public good, then what is? We haven't seen to date any kind of reasonable institutional response to that challenge that now everybody knows is on the table. And so I think that's where we kind of need actually innovation, research, like, okay, how do we set up institutions that are effective at doing that? And the reason I'm saying that is because from where I kind of from the observatory role that I had, at least in one of those, is that currently there is no champions of those institutions. And if anything, it's not the bilaterals that are setting the agendas, but it's more and more the private foundations. Now, the private foundations have zero accountability. They may think they know what they're doing, they have zero accountability, and that doesn't seem like an optimal kind of role to live in. And so that's kind of what I wanted to put on the table. I think there's a big question there that we're missing, that requires probably a bit more research and thinking, but also innovations and trying out the institutional setup to make this work. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. To follow up on this, in principle, when we talk about development aid, you can also involve countries like China as well. And so it's not just US and Europe who can work on issues like zoonotic diseases, but also you can involve non-Western donor countries. But indeed, it's very hard to imagine that several countries together through a multilateral or just setting up a separate fund could actually do that. But there are precedents. There are initiatives, global initiatives for climate fund, green fund, right? So green climate fund. So these initiatives exist. Do you think? Are you optimistic that that can actually happen? To set up a research institution to address this issue, working on a global public good, which is a new agricultural technology, new medical solutions for global problems.
Yeah. So in a certain way, for the agricultural technologies, the institution exists.
Yes, I know.
It's
But
arguably
it's tiny. Yeah,
it's tiny, probably underfunded, and probably has an institutional setup that was designed
60s.
exactly in the 60s and the 70s that may not be the right one. So I think the big challenge there, which is why I'm saying I think we need research on this, the big challenge is if you need to provide the global public good here is an R&D, whether that's on the zoonotic diseases or on the agricultural side. And so the people that we know about that is the scientists, right? So the scientists that are on the frontier of those know kind of in a certain way what's feasible, what will it take to get to the next step. They have, of course, their own incentives, like any scientist did, to kind of, speak for their. The bilaterals, or for that matter, the national foundation, or the big private foundations, don't have the expertise, but they have the money. And so what you need is kind of set up an institution that somehow allows kind of the people that decide on the money to have enough confidence in the system that the scientists propose, while not having perfect information on this. And so I think it's a pure mechanism design problem that just people haven't kind of thought about. Look, I think we need a bunch of mechanism design people to think about this problem, because it must be possible to set up a set of rules that does this better. And so Michael Kremer, one of the Nobel Prize winners, his take on this in part is what you need is kind of more pull mechanisms. So we know that works for vaccines, right? If you set up a promise of paying a lot of money if you come up with a vaccine, for instance, for malaria, then you may incentivize the pharmaceutical industry enough to do so. And that may work for certain innovations, but it's probably not going to work for other ones. In part, again, if you think of the agricultural part, to have some kind of results-based financing in this case, you need to have effective adoption at very high levels by 500 million smallholders across the world in a certain way, and kind of tracing that and making that happen probably takes more than the global public good. And so that's why the results-based financing model has challenges. Now, I think that's probably one way of going and thinking more carefully about. And then that probably needs to, probably does need to come with something that is more push. But that kind of gets, as I said, kind of somebody needs to think about this carefully, how to set this up.
Thank you, Karen. I moved to Joel. So Joel, you mentioned that you're interested in other existential problems, which is a global debt crisis of rising debt levels of developing countries, and also the problem of conflicts and fragile states.
Yeah, then there will be some linkages to some of the very interesting comments that Karen made. And thank you all for staying. It's the last panel of the day of a very busy day and an engaging day, and I appreciate your all being here. Look, I want to take the discussion to a very broad level and thinking about the development challenges that we are going to be facing in the coming years, and an assessment of whether, in particular, the transatlantic relationship, the U.S., former Paris Club, the Paris Club nations, to what extent they are mobilized to engage in the challenges that are coming ahead. And I think we have to start with a recognition that we often forget, which is that essentially the last 30 years have been one of the most extraordinary years of poverty reduction the world has ever seen. And it's something that we haven't fully internalized, but the extent of the era that we, all of us, this generation, has lived through is just quite extraordinary. I mean, the figures alone, and many of you here will know it, but in 1990 or thereabouts, about 45–50% of the world's population lived under extreme poverty, the World Bank's extreme poverty line. That number has come down to less than 8%. Over 1 billion people moved out of extreme poverty in the course of a generation. And with that, extraordinary shifts in just about every indicator of human development, whether it's maternal mortality, education, women's participation. I mean, just absolutely extraordinary changes. And I mean, we tend to focus on the problems of the world, but we often just don't recognize the extraordinary shifts that occurred in the era that we lived through. Following up on some things that Karen said, I wouldn't necessarily say that tremendous progress was a result of fabulous multilateral development aid projects, which I agree, the assessments showed had relatively low returns. There are multiple reasons that one can give, largely driven by countries and countries' own engagement, largely driven by the global integration and the extraordinary sort of integration of markets around the world into global supply chains. One could argue that there were core consensus issues developed over the last 30 years, especially on macroeconomic policy, not microeconomic impact, which essentially changed behavior of governments on issues like inflation, on issues like public debt, and it really was an extraordinary period. I think we have to start for that because we have lived in that era and have kind of, to some extent, forgotten what it's like to be in an era where poverty is not reducing, and where actually the trends may move in the opposite direction. Essentially, that great era of poverty reduction ended in 2020, ended with COVID and COVID's impact. And obviously, COVID was this exogenous impact, which is not likely going to change the ultimate trajectory. But I think it is a marker because it led to an extraordinary change in the global economy, which has had tremendous impacts around the world. One set of countries I want to talk a little bit about is the fragile and conflict-affected states. We can argue about the proper definition of what constitutes fragile and conflict-affected states. The World Bank's indicators talk about a group of approximately 35 or so sort of countries that during that extraordinary period of poverty reduction essentially did not show any sort of significant progress in their ability to reduce extreme poverty, so that while the rest of the world was showing this tremendous growth, this tremendous effort in reducing poverty, there was a group of countries, about 35 or so. The OECD gives an expanded definition to about 50 to 60 countries. But there was a group of countries that essentially did not participate in that extraordinary global shift in reducing poverty. And I believe that, sort of about 10 years or so maybe, largely linked to America's adventures in Afghanistan and Iraq, put the issue of fragile states almost at the top of the development agenda, a recognition that they should be there because it was the last mile, or it seemed to be the last mile of poverty reduction. And there was a tremendous amount of energy and effort driven by security concerns, actually, I think, in Afghanistan and Iraq and elsewhere, in Somalia and others, to start thinking about how to rethink parts of the global development agenda, the multilateral development institutions, the way in which aid was provided, to start to say, how do we need to rethink this agenda for a bunch of countries that essentially have not been enjoying the fruits of this extraordinary period of growth. And there was an enormous amount of activity And there was actually, the seeds of innovation. There was actually, I think, tremendous agreement on the transatlantic relationship between the United States and the key donor countries in the EU about this agenda. There was a commitment to increase the overall amount or the share of aid that went to fragile and conflict-affected states relative to the overall share, even though they didn't reach the commitments that they made on overall aid agenda. But there was a sense of momentum in trying to do something about it. That momentum required some very, very significant changes in the way that the multilateral development architecture and the security architecture worked. Because what was happening in these fragile and conflict-affected states was that there was an intersection between development issues and security issues. And the architecture, the global architecture, was essentially divided between development actors and security actors, between peace builders and development actors. And there was barely any true engagement between those two worlds. In fact, they were different. They were different worlds in almost every respect. People were trained differently. People had different career paths. People had different understandings, different approaches, different institutions. And the idea of starting to rethink development so that you are actually thinking about poverty reduction in countries that were deeply impacted by conflict, either actively engaged in conflict or deeply impacted by conflict and looked at post-conflict reconstruction, was an agenda that was gaining steam within the last sort of 5 to 10 years. But with the end of the United States participation in Afghanistan and Iraq, with, as the earlier panel sort of suggested, the overwhelming focus of U.S. Foreign policy thinking on China, it has essentially crowded out any significant thinking on the U.S. side about this agenda of what to do in this last mile of poverty reduction. And I think it has dissipated any energy to do significant, almost radical reforms that are required in the development and security architecture in order to start thinking about how to be more effective in this group of countries that have been so impervious to poverty reduction efforts. So what I see now is a group of countries that continue to face enormous challenges. COVID has significantly increased those challenges by adding significant food insecurity issues to their agenda, by adding sort of significant health risks to their agenda, although not as much as we had feared at the beginning. But also we are sort of seeing a remarkable change in the broader global environment that's impacting fragile states as well, with the slowing of global growth rates, in particular the slowing of China's growth rates, all of which are putting far more pressures on this group that has already not been seeing the progress that it needs to make. In addition to this group of fragile and conflict-affected states, which seem to be even more mired in difficult problems going forward, what we're seeing is in the countries outside of the fragile and conflict-affected realm that had been making the tremendous progress in poverty reduction are also seeing much slower improvements and facing much more sort of significant headwinds on their own debt profiles. So if we move out of the fragile and conflict-affected states and look at much larger developing and emerging market economies, like Pakistan, like Sri Lanka, like Kenya, like Ghana, these were countries that were doing reasonably well over the last 20 years, showing reasonably decent growth rates over a reasonably lengthy period of times. They were accessing global markets. They were borrowing on the Eurobond markets. They were integrating into the global sort of supply chain. They were offering domestic bonds to their own constituencies, and they were enjoying the fruits of what seemed to be fairly decent. In most cases, I wouldn't say they were extraordinary policy sort of successes, but they were moving along and growing quite substantially. Now, with the shift in the global, in the global economic circumstances, with the shift in global interest rates, with a changing appetite for risk among bondholders and direct investors, And of course, with the pulling back of China as a strong bilateral investor, we are starting to see now, in addition to the problems on the fragile and conflict side, conflict state side, we are seeing in the less developed countries, those that were fueling this extraordinary growth in poverty reduction, we are seeing a level of debt distress that we haven't seen in literally a couple of decades. 60% of low-income countries are now in debt distress. The number of countries that are that have seen downgrades in their debt has essentially tripled in the course of sort of 3 years. The access to markets to refinance their debt is virtually ended as the Eurobond market for low-income countries has become so tight that it is virtually excluding a lot of countries that have gained in it. And their domestic bond markets have teetered significantly. So on the fragile state side and on the low income sort of side, what we're seeing is we are entering into an era entirely different than the era that we have lived through over the last sort of 20, 30 years. We lived through an era of this tremendous poverty reduction. We are entering an era in which some of the drivers of that poverty reduction are facing tremendous headwinds. The fragile and conflict-affected states that never gained from the true global growth are finding themselves even in deeper distress, which of course is enhancing and exacerbating the migration crisis, which is impacting politics around the world. And at this very moment, when we ought to be pivoting to say we are going to face a potentially massive crisis. It may not be a systemic financial crisis on the order of the 2008 financial crisis. I don't think that this debt crisis reaches that level and that proportion. But what will happen, of course, is that in response to these debt challenges, in response to the fragile states challenges, what you're going to see is much, much less reduced fiscal space for investing in education and health and infrastructure and other forms of growth. We are seeing some deceleration and uncoupling of global sort of supply chains as the competition with China and the West sort of heats up, forcing countries to make choices about how they're going to engage in the global supply chain. And it's just going to create an enormous set of pressures on developing countries that we really haven't engage with in decades. And I think it is at this very moment when we should be thinking about this and putting this on the agenda, it has virtually vanished from the agenda, I would argue. There is no serious effort and engagement of reform of the multilateral institutions. There's talk of it. Janet Yellen has made a speech about multilateral development, but there's almost zero interest in this in the United States. I think there's more interest of it here on this side of the Atlantic, partly because of the migration issues that people can link directly to these development challenges. But as you mentioned, it's certainly not showing up in the numbers, of assistance. But beyond the amount of assistance provided, I'm actually less concerned about the amount of assistance provided. I'm just more concerned about the lack of a political will to engage in the serious discussions about reform of the development architecture, both multilateral, bilateral, foundations and the role that foundations and private foundations play on this. A new architecture for debt resolution, which has a new set of players, because the debt resolution mechanism used to be largely a multilateral and Paris Club discussion. Now they're minor players in the in most of these debt discussions. China is the largest bilateral borrower. India is a major bilateral creditor. China is the largest bilateral creditor. Other nations that have not Paris Club nations are playing a more and more significant role. So what concerns me now is that we are so focused on China. We are so focused now on a great power and the return of great power competition. At the very moment where complacency on the development agenda is, I think, extremely dangerous and volatile for us. And what's needed more than the financial commitments, so I think the financial commitments are important. What's needed more is a serious engagement among the key kind of global players on rethinking aspects of the global architecture for development, which needs to sort of essentially be a foundation for this new era, and I just don't see it happening. I will end with one kind of positive note. I think, following up on some of the things that Sergey said, we do see some really interesting engagements in the global South of trying to set that agenda. So if any of you are following the work that Mia Motley and the Bridgetown Initiative is doing, bringing together countries that have been impacted by climate change, the Vulnerable 20, the V20 group that Ghana leads, of bringing together the countries that have been impacted by climate change and say, we should be trying to set the global development agenda as we have been impacted on this, rather than waiting for the Europeans and the US. And I think those are positive signs. I still think they are nascent. They will require an enormous amount of effort to bring to fruition any sort of significant proposals. And I have to say they're having a incredibly modest impact on the important agenda for reform of the multilateral institutions, which seem almost impervious to change. So I want to make sure that that gets back on the agenda, that serious thinking about reform of the development architecture gets back on the agenda, that serious reform of the multilateral institutions get back on the development agenda, and that as a political issue, a recognition that we are facing this era of significant shift in the overall poverty reduction story, and knowing that we are going to be facing 20 years, the next 20 years, not of a world in which poverty is decreasing, but at least in which the progress is flatlining, if not going in the other way.
Thank you, Joel. Unfortunately, this is a reasonably bleak picture as well. To add to this pessimistic analysis, I should say that we may not be talking about this too much, given the post-COVID debt crisis in our own countries, the polarization, disinformation, the war in Ukraine, the crisis in the Middle East. But we live at the time where the number of refugees is rising, both in the US and in Europe. Numbers are very, very high. That creates social and political problems as well. And as a migration scholar, I can add that there is no way to project the decline in number of migrants from poor countries. If anything, if we are successful in development, there'll be more immigration. There is a famous nonlinear relationship between per capita income and immigration. When countries move from low income to middle income, number of immigrants actually is coming up and not down. So in that sense, we need to think about these issues every day and not be too optimistic. But I have a question for you. You mentioned that there is no interest, no political will to think about the reform of multilateral institutions. If you were in the driver's seat, if you were deciding how to reform the development framework, the development institutions, and I'm not saying if you were Secretary of Treasury, because that position is not necessarily sufficiently powerful to reform the whole multilateral development framework, but if you were Secretary of all treasuries and President of all countries, including Barbados, what would you do with the development institutions?
It's a great question. I would take there's a number of ways to think about this, and number of directions that can take. One direction is to actually think about how you essentially create an architecture through evaluation and effort to sort of learn how to make more impactful projects on the project dimension. But I'm going to look at it more from the macro side. I think there are two issues that I would focus on. One is the reform of voice in the international development architecture, because I think that the innovation that is going to come, that could come, really is going to come from countries who actually lived the last 30 years of experience. We sometimes think of that sort of tremendous success of the last 30 years as we had such great development assistance and great development projects that it led to this extraordinary growth. And obviously the story is much, much more complex than that. There is extraordinary kind of country experience by fast developing countries over the last 30 years who have been actually demanding a sort of stronger voice in multilateral development banks, in global institutions, and we have resisted that. I mean, essentially the US has resisted that, the European nations have resisted that. They still hold on to a Bretton Woods architecture that was that was designed in a world that was so remarkably different in terms of the distribution of economic and political power. So I think a critical step of this is to finally start to shift the shareholding structure and the voice and mechanisms for voice in these institutions as a way just to shake things up. You can't say by definition that is going to produce sort of solutions to the crisis, but what it will do, first of all, is kind of create a much greater confidence in a forum for engagement across multiple institutions than the current institutions do now. So I think voice is a critical first step in that. The second thing I would sort of say, and it goes back to the issue of fragility and conflict. One thing I didn't mention is that the nature of extreme poverty has changed quite a bit over the last 30 years. And if we actually project over the next 10 to 20 years, depending upon how you define fragility and conflict in the nations in conflict, but even the conservative estimates would suggest that whereas the fragile and conflict-affected states were a problem in the last 30 years, they were still a small share of the world's extreme poor. In the next 30 years, they are going to be the majority share of the world's extreme poor. And if the majority of the world's extreme poor are concentrated in countries impacted by fragility and conflict, it means that the way in which you do development, since if development is essentially a poverty reduction effort, and poverty and where the locus of poverty has changed, and the drivers of poverty, which are deeply linked to conflict and post-conflict reconstruction and healing, then we need to rethink how you do development, because this is not only just a classic, shift from rural to urban, the kind of core drivers that we think of in China and India and in the largely populated countries. These are countries whose poverty are linked to that intersection of those issues. And in my view, the multilateral development institutions in particular, and the UN system in particular, have been very, very slow to try to essentially revise their architecture to enable them to do development work in these kinds of environments. Literally, there are aspects of their articles of agreement that prevent them from doing significant development work in some of these contexts. The kinds of projects that they do in these projects are deeply limited by the rules which were created for working in stable environments. The procurement rule, some very sort of specific hands-on things. How you do procurement, how you do financial management, how you handle corruption, how you handle environmental issues. All of those things, all of that rule book for the international development assistance that crosses all multilateral institutions were developed for working in relatively stable economies and don't fit working in conflict-affected and fragile states. So you need to start unpacking that architecture and say, how do you achieve some of the same objectives, but in a different way? And so I think that serious agenda needs to be put on the table. And I just don't think the shareholders of these organizations are ready to do that.
Thank you, Joel. I would come back to your argument about Afghanistan, where World Bank did work side by side with NATO. And in that sense, it's not something that we've not tried. So we don't need to merge World Bank and NATO. We know that these organizations can actually work together. So one of the things I would like to mention on the optimistic side, given that we have students in the room, the generational change can actually help. When I worked in the Multilateral Development Bank, my problem was, exactly as Karen said, we've learned so much about how to measure impact of interventions. And many of the people who ran and still are running multilateral development institutions went to school before that, before Esther Duflo graduated from her PhD studies at MIT. And it was actually hard to talk to some decision makers saying that we actually have a measure, we have a methodology to measure the impacts and improve efficiency of the interventions. And now when we have more students coming up, and also students who are more open to reform of multilateral institutions, also we know a bit about Chinese development aid, when there was a discussion about the need for reforming the shareholder structure. China was dissatisfied and said, we'll set up our own development infrastructure. And now we see that it's not necessarily worked too well. as you rightly said. So we've learned so much over the last couple of decades that maybe, even given the challenges that both of you have identified in the years to come, there is still some scope for optimism. Let me open the floor for questions. We have 45 minutes. We don't need to stay the whole 45 minutes, but Arantxa has a question. Arantxa brought Mia actually to speak to Sciences Po students, right? Mia Motley, that was the case. Yeah. Yeah. And it was a fully packed auditorium.
So I like a lot the this idea that we have to reform the international system, because it's true that it's not fit for purpose. But when I look at it, let me tell you what I see, and then, ask you for advice. Because seen from Europe, this is both a priority but an enormous difficulty. So if I look at the reform of the international financial architecture, reforming voice or quota means changing a balance of power between China and the US. So we bump into Congress. I've done a fair amount of work on reforming the international trading system, the World Trade Organization. Any attempt at reforming the World Trade Organization ends up being a fight between China and the US, and we end up bumping into US Congress. Let me take a third example, health. We had a pandemic. We know that having an international treaty that would help us prepare better for the next pandemic is something that a lot of folks around the world would love to have, but then we bump into US Congress. So how do we deal with, obviously, the necessity to reform the international financial architecture, but at the same time do this in a very geopolitical charged context, where any reform of this architecture would be seen through the lens of a zero-sum game between China and the US?
It is a critical issue. Not, I don't know. I don't want to necessarily say it's the critical issue, but it is absolutely critical. And my argument would be that we seriously misunderstand the geopolitical motivations for preserving the status quo. And your assessment is absolutely right, that any suggestion, even minor, change of tenths of a percent, in voting rights, is seen as, out of the question, because we will be seen as essentially ceding control to China. And I think then that gets Congress all upset, and nothing happens. But I actually think that it just hasn't been framed in a very different way. And I think here's the way I would sort of frame it. By preventing change in the shareholding of the multilateral system, we are actually driving more countries out of America's engagement and influence towards China, because of the belief of the fundamental inequity of the sort of structure of these institutions, and giving China the voice to sort of say, we actually speak for all of you, who are essentially excluded from the rightful voice that you should have in these institutions. So, like reform of the World Bank and the IMF, it's not an important domestic issue in the United States. Nobody cares about the World Bank and the IMF in the United States domestic political system. If the U.S. withdrew from the World Bank and the IMF, nobody would care in the United States. It would barely make a story in my mind. The stakes in domestic politics for this are not high. It is the perception that this is a zero-sum game with China that makes the stakes high. And I think if there's a greater recognition that preserving the status quo, which has virtually no benefit to the United States in terms of achieving outcomes, also has no benefits for the United States in bringing into a stronger strategic alignment with the United States countries of the global south, which are increasingly feeling isolated from the US. So this is ultimately doing damage to America's sort of strategic interests, and I think ultimately doing damage to America's competition with China. We're here with students, I do exercises all the time with my students in role play on development issues. And I can tell you, no matter how many country teams that I create, and I try to kind of have students do African country teams, Latin American country teams, Indian country teams, and in the end of the exercise, they all end up siding with China against the United States and Europe. Because, I mean, once you start to look at, the kind of the fundamental relationship that has changed radically between China and the rest of the developing world, so the stakes that they have in preserving a strong relationship with China are strong, and the resentment that U.S. preservation and European preservation of outdated institutions that reflect the structure of 70 years ago, it's just driving people away. So I actually think that using your very same logic, that in a strategic competition with China, the smartest thing to do is actually for the US and Europe to be in the lead of saying, we want to give greater voice to India. We want to greater voice to, the largest economies in Africa, Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, Ghana. And we want to bring them onto our side of saying we are open to that kind of shift in the global architecture and their voice, because I think that's in our strategic interest.
Actually, ask Karen the same question. From a European perspective, the status quo is leading to a great increase in number of refugees, climate refugees, right? And if we think about this, not doing much, even with all the optimism that we are now more effective measuring the impact, collecting evidence, why people seem to be able not to think about this? Then remember that in 2015-16, the refugee crisis was about 1 million people moving to Europe. Another 3 or 4 million were in Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, but 1 million moved to Europe, and that created a political upheaval. Climate refugees, we are talking about 200 million coming from Africa, mostly to Europe, right? And so, it's not an American problem. America has a different immigration problem. But for Europe, it's a very tangible issue that if we don't solve the issue you were talking about, why politicians and civil society seems to be very capable of forgetting about this problem?
It's a great question. To me, some of this is pure information. I'll start with a story, I'm a microeconomist, so I tell micro stories, but it's related to your point on China. So a couple of years ago, I worked on a big project in Congo, the DR Congo in Equateur. Equateur is the province of the former Mobutu, okay? One of the poorest places in the world. This is pure rainforest, horrible infrastructure, the type of place where in a week maybe one car passes at best. Okay? So I'm Belgian. I was very hesitant initially to work in Congo, but I did that for this particular project. I was shocked on my first trip when in the middle of the rainforest, and we come by villages where, as I said, almost one car a week passes. The children in the street see the car, and what they were saying was "ni hao, ni hao," because the one car passing must be a Chinese, right? And so the reason I'm telling that story is because on the field, and that's that's the micro story, but you see this everywhere in sub-Saharan Africa. This is the reality. The presence of China and if you take that together with the ineffectiveness is a lot of the interventions of the past, and the fact that growth probably hasn't come from the development interventions, but from other parts, then that is the reality that you see on the ground when you're going on the ground, but that you don't see when you sit in Paris, in Brussels, in Berlin, and where we have very little exposure to that, right? And so to be part of it, because of course there's not going to be pressure on politicians if nobody knows about this in a certain, not just this particular story, but if nobody sees the day-to-day challenges that people face in these set of countries and why they may be moving. So I'm with you. There's been a fantastic 30 years of growth, not just in economic growth, and all the indicators of human capital have, tremendous progress that we couldn't imagine. In my opinion, unfortunately, we're not in that world anymore. In fact, I stopped talking about developing countries. I'm now saying low and middle income countries because I'm not sure whether they're developing and in which direction and what this exactly means. And we've seen a lot of countries going backwards, including countries that had tremendous progress. Take Ethiopia, a fantastic growth story over the last 20 years. A horrible story over the last 3-4 years. And that's just one example.
Headed by a Nobel Peace Prize winner.
Headed by a Nobel Peace Prize winner. How often do you read in Le Monde or Figaro what's happening in Ethiopia? Nobody knows, right? And so it's hard for politicians in Europe or in the US, for that matter, to engage if there is if this is not on the radar, nobody's going to put pressure on that. And so for me, that's kind of part of what as part of the global infrastructure, we may be part of this kind of something that somebody should be investing in.
Thank you. We actually touched on this when we talked about security and defense issues, that there are estimates that number of deaths in Ethiopia, Tigray civil war, is actually exceeding the number of deaths in Ukrainian war. And yet, as you rightly said, this is not really on the radar screen of anybody. But that doesn't mean that the problem will disappear and will solve itself. Questions from the audience? Yeah, there is a question. Brian? Yeah. You should speak to the microphone because we have people online.
Thank you. So I think there's an interesting profusion of incredible data available at lower latency that never existed before, geospatial data, environmental data, scenario-based analysis to do much better prediction and understanding. Are those capabilities improving the efficiency and agility of the international community to intervene more effectively, or is it still just disconnected?
Do you have any
This is
evaluations on that?
Yes, there is work on this. I mean, so this is a very active field of research because I think the possibilities of remote sensing in particular are incredibly promising, but also still very much in development, right? And so, there are, talking about Ethiopia, this would be the type of place where, because in addition to the conflict-related issues, it's also a country that historically has had lots of weather shocks and drought shocks. And so this is the type of place where, there is attempts of having early warning systems with mixed success. One of the interesting successes I've seen recently is on, so that's a combination of remote sensing and weather models. So in some parts of the world, in particular in South Asia, the onset of the monsoon, the models seems to be good enough to now have good predictions of onset of monsoons. And so the onset of monsoon, drives all decisions at the micro level in South Asia, and having those decisions wrong has kind of dramatic consequences because you either don't have the seeds in time, you don't have the right seeds, and whatever else. And so that's an example where we now have some emerging evidence, experimental, very rigorous evidence of if you get those forecasts in time and you can diffuse them, that makes a big difference. Now, we don't know this yet at scale, and I think that's, for the students in the room, we've made tremendous progress about figuring out impacts of interventions, of programs in micro settings. We don't know much yet about how do we scale effectively. And so, same thing, this is now a tool that seems to work. Now, how do you scale that? How do you get that out to the hundreds of millions of farmers that could use this? To me, that's kind of the next question.
Yeah, when we talk about the last mile of poverty eradication, we talk about countries with very limited state capacity, usually not having good disaggregated statistics, and their remote sensing really changes everything. We can measure level of development at a very disaggregated level, which helps evaluating impact, which helps monitoring what's going on. We can measure quality of roads, we can see the vegetation, we can measure harvest. That also provides opportunities to fight corruption when we actually see if the road was built or not built from satellite and not asking the corrupt officials if they built that road or not. So this is changing things a lot, and that is both satellite data and AI, machine learning, which helps image recognitions and so on. And we are not there yet, but it is completely standard right now to use satellite night light data for measuring development at the subnational level. And interestingly, and this is, I would say, a good thing, is if you want to measure development in this part of Paris, it will be very imprecise because at this level of development, satellite data are not giving you a good level of precision with the income per capita. There is a saturation, but at the low income in low income countries, it's a very important measure that everybody's using.
I also want to add that on the issue of security and conflict, it really opens up tremendous possibilities as well, because the big problem about working in fragile and conflict-affected states was obviously the security issue around doing development work. I mean, as you rightly pointed out, there was an interaction between NATO and development institutions in Afghanistan that was a complete and utter failure, because, essentially, trying to secure development through the militarization of aid and assistance is doomed to failure for many, many reasons. So the question is, how do you do development work in insecure settings? The opportunity for, all these tools to bring, opportunities for monitoring, opportunities for information dissemination and sharing, staffing and dealing with staffing issues. One of the perennial problems of why, such little work was done in many of these difficult environments was the difficulty in getting staff to work in those environments. It was much better to work in China and India and Turkey and Brazil than it was to work in Somalia and Yemen and, in other countries. So it really opens up a lot of possibilities. I still think it's very, very early stages, but I think it is the kind of generational shift, if what Sergey is suggesting, one of the things that is a sign of optimism is that a new generation would bring very new tools to these problems.
Hello, my name is Aisha. I'm not associated with either school, so maybe a civilian representative today. But I think I've heard over and over throughout the talks people identifying different white spaces, and Karen, you just spoke to one. We have a lot of young people in the audience who could potentially come in to fill those spaces. What advice would you give, I guess specifically for your worlds in development, to fill those spaces that need to be filled? Somebody needs to do this, so what advice would you give to them? And is that an opportunity for transatlantic relations to be reinvigorated by these new projects that could possibly bring in more cohesion and cooperation?
So I'm gonna play the professor here because that's what I am. I think in order to be able to identify those empty spaces, you kind of first need to know what are the spaces in a certain way that are filled, right? And so I think in a certain way that's become the challenge, because there is so much. It's so much harder to get to the frontier of the development kind of thinking more generally, to then be able to see the spaces. But I do think that, and I've seen this, in some of the work I've done. You interact with kind of social entrepreneurs in different countries that kind of seem to have, the next golden solution, and very often they're not aware of, what we know from elsewhere, and they kind of, and in a certain way too naive to having been found the open space. No, so then the advice there is to, if you can't, so part of it is investment yourself in kind of the knowledge, and part of it is to reach out and to kind of, in a certain way, to not be naive about it, but kind of, crowd in knowledge from others and from experts in the relevant field.
This is one of the key challenges in development organizations: the knowledge management, the dissemination of takeaways, lessons learned, and this is what Karen was talking about CPR, this VoxDev initiative, where we try to publish what we know about this and this and this intervention. And unfortunately, or fortunately for social scientists, effect of intervention may depend on the context, on socio-economic context, on institutions. So what works in one country may not work in another country, unfortunately. But at least we know so much more now than 20 years ago or 30 years ago. Then there is a lot of knowledge to be learned from, and listening to professors is always a good idea.
Well, I think one thing that does concern me, though, is that while in economics there really has been this kind of flowering of engagement and interest, and more young economists are working in this sort of space. And, the Nobel Prize for, for the impact evaluation work has generated an enormous amount of excitement. And there seems to be a lot of energy there. But if you look at the overall picture of people who are thinking about career paths, professional kind of career paths and development, I'll take my school. I'd love to hear what is happening here in Sciences Po and at PSIA. Well, there are 5 times as many students who go into our security studies program that go into our development program. There are, 5 times many students who go into our diplomacy, kind of in broad international affairs development that go into the development program. Because development issues have really fallen off the radar screen of political dialogue. So oddly enough, I think paradoxically, though these were not great times, but Afghanistan and Iraq, because of American security concerns and European and NATO security concerns, brought these issues onto the agenda. They were talked about a lot. There were conferences and discussions. There was a lot of student interest and engagement on that. And that has dissipated a lot as the shift to great power competition has just taken attention away from this entire agenda. And so one of the things I like being on these panels, one reason why I wanted to come here, was just to urge students and the next generation to be thinking much more seriously about this, because if you look at the, essentially the range of threats that this next generation is going to be facing. We lived in the, in this period of, just tremendous poverty reduction that we, that created an enormous global goods. And if that era has ended, and we face a very different era, it has security challenges, it has political challenges, it certainly has migration challenges and others. And I just don't think people are paying enough attention to it. So my biggest urge is to urge students to think about developing more of their efforts to career paths and development, and getting the training that they need, taking advantage of the real innovation that's coming from the academic space, and trying to think about how you scale that up into practical development work.
Thank you. Other questions? Arantxa, you want to say a word on the relative attractiveness of security and development programs in PSIA? Same?
Exactly the same. It's exactly the same pattern. We have an explosion on security and defense. I'm not surprised by that, given what's happening around us. We have an explosion in governance and diplomacy, probably because it's broad enough that you don't have to make a decision about what the next step would be. And we have a relatively stable crowd on development. It's pretty much the same. Now, I also wanted to the point of data and how much more we know today of what works and what doesn't work, and also the much more granular knowledge that countries have of themselves. But we should not think that granularity of data and knowledge of a reality equals changing and the reality. At the end of the day, one of the big lessons I think we have learned, and especially in fragility and conflict settings, is that development has a lot to do with endogenous capacities to institutionalize, to have a desire, and parties within a country that have a desire to change. So this endogenous element should not fall off our debate. At least we think that with a lot of good data and good analytics and good artificial intelligence, a lot of smart people, the problems on the ground would be solved. There has to be an energy in the countries themselves, good, also kind of positive trade-offs, carrots, not only sticks, that can make for transformation on the ground.
Well, this is also an issue of human capital, people going back to the country or studying in those countries. And unfortunately, the reality is exactly as Karen and Joel have said. Academic economists, development economists do go to poor countries. Highly trained bankers are not allowed to go to poor countries, and especially countries in conflict and fragile countries. Yeah, and I have my own experience when I worked in the BRD. I traveled to countries with red terrorist attacks, and our security officers would give me special devices to call if something happens. and even gave me a plastic piece of plastic that I could block my door in the hotel in case people will try to force their way in my door. So, but jokes aside, it's actually a huge issue that the last mile of poverty reduction will be very, very difficult, exactly because of the issues that we mentioned, that it's not just economic development, it's also governance, institutions, security, which is at risk. Any more questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. You mentioned that like securing development due to military means is doomed to failure, since we've seen it in Afghanistan. But in war-torn countries like the Congo, what are your suggestions? What should we do? Should we like don't take military measures at all, or like what are the options?
Well, I mean, there's several different aspects of the relationship between security and development. All right, so one of them is kind of peace-building operations and how they relate to development operations. And I think there was a very, very unsophisticated approach in Afghanistan and Iraq, kind of almost assuming that security was something you could use development as a bribe for security. As essentially forward-looking troops going out and essentially distributing cash payouts in exchange for information on security issues, and that ended very badly because obviously it undermines any kind of trust, it undermines any kind of ability to do development work. Look, I think that there are two different types of engagements to think about, in tools to think about in working in fragile states. And I think they go to some of the issues that were already raised here. Arantxa raised the issue of endogenous capacity, right? And think about how you deliver aid much more, not through shipping in development actors from the outside, but trying to work more effectively with local players that have more freedom of movement, have more ability to engage locally, understand more the local context. The other fascinating thing is, just like your story in DRC, and this fascinates me, and I don't have an answer to it, but, it is remarkable that the Chinese, the Turks, Indians, and other countries have shown remarkable ability to engage in countries that many of the other kind of normal development actors, multilateral development actors, have not been able to engage with. And we really don't know why. What's the experience? What did the Chinese do differently that enable them? They work in Somalia, they work they work in DRC, they work in CAR, they work in extremely difficult environments. One would normally think that the lack of property rights, the security issues, the difficulties on the legal and corruption front, they have to impact everyone who engages in that. And yet there are actors who have managed to work and engage in these countries. And actually we really haven't studied and understood why they've been able to work effectively at that. If you look at Somalia, Turkey is very active in Somalia, and in very constructive ways. They have very different rules, very different tolerance for corruption, very different tolerance for insecurity than others, but they manage to work effectively. So I think that there's an opportunity to try to understand how these other players worked in insecure environments. And then finally, I think the role of technology is going to play, have massive shifts in our ability to monitor, engage, communicate, and track in ways that are only just being fully recognized. So I think that opens up a lot of opportunities for working. And the traditional way of thinking about securing development, which is embedding development actors in forward, military outreach, is just that form of securing development shown very much in Afghanistan and Iraq that it's just not a way of going.
This is not exactly an answer to the question, but it's tying back to some of the comments. So one of the areas where I think both sides of the Atlantic have kind of decreased investment is in human capital building of people in the global south. And so one of the technology there provides a new opportunity. And so one of the new JPAL initiatives, actually, the kind of the vision of JPAL, so the Jameel Poverty Action Lab over the next 10 years, is to have more and more training partner institutions in the global south that can do training for the local capacity, because then you know, in a certain way, they're better able to understand the context, they're better able to influence, they're better able to move. There's so many different ways that can do that. And the reason that is possible now is because you know, and this is happening in Abidjan as we speak, the students in the statistical school in Abidjan are taking the MicroMaster at MIT, and are getting, you know, coaching in French to help that process. And so the idea is to replicate that in a number of different campuses. I was in Addis in the summer, you know, while this conflict is happening. I was so there's an annual conference of the Ethiopian Economic Association, which has 5,000 members. They come together, they throw a conference, you know, the capacity is there. And so being able to kind of think creatively, I think, in investing in those kind of initiatives or initiatives that are multilateral at that level, to me has a high potential. It is under the radar and is, you know, could potentially kind of be a way forward, especially since we know how difficult it is for our foreign students to come here. I was kind of thinking as you were all reflecting on how little interest there is in development. So at PSC, we have a bit of a different balance, but I think that's partly because
you don't have a security problem.
We don't have a security problem, but also we try to actively recruit from low and middle income countries as much as we can. But the visa issues, the lack of financial resources from, you know, either the French government or elsewhere to do so are very limiting, and that's kind of striking. That seems to be like the low-hanging fruit, right? And so some combination of the classical with kind of the more technology-driven kind of local, I think, is kind of one thing that kind of collectively we should be thinking much more about.
Yeah, I would just add to this discussion. In your question, it almost sounded like, do we have success stories of fragile states becoming developing countries, developing in the right direction? And I would just give an example of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which was a place where you had a horrible, horrible civil war where people killed each other in thousands and hated each other and still pretty much hate each other. But peacekeeping operation, European accession perspective, reestablished peace. This is still a very divided country. Constitution is very peculiar. It's still one of the poorest, if not the poorest countries in Europe. But there is peace, there is investment, there is development, there is accession roadmap. So it's moving in the right direction. It's very close to Europe, so it's easier to send European officials there, right? And it's it's something which is very, very tangible. Something which was a place of genocide just on the doorstep of Europe is now the country which is probably going to be a member state in the 10 or 20 years. So it's there are stories like this around the world. Another thing,
in Africa as well. I mean, if you think about Liberia, Sierra Leone, Rwanda, Uganda, Mozambique, I mean, none of those countries are, you know,
Jeffersonian democracies.
They're not Jeffersonian democracies, and they're not stunning success stories. But what they have managed to do is, over a significant period of time, maintain relative sort of peace after, you know, vicious, traumatic violence, not just conflict, but, you know, true trauma, social trauma. And they've managed over time. I'm amazed at how little we have understood, and I don't think it's because of development projects from, you know, multilateral institutions that have paved the way, but we still really not have understood many of the stories that have shown sort of success. There are those, and I think we need to kind of go deeper and try to understand what, you know, what led them to the success that they have had.
Yeah, and on technology, this actually is something I do research on. In the last 15 years, we have a huge expansion of mobile broadband internet. And that creates opportunities that Karen was talking about for people studying online, for financial development, of course, because mobile payment systems have revolutionized access to savings, access to payment, access to information about market prices. So lots of things have changed, and this is very, very recent. Of course, 3G, 4G are less widespread in Africa than in Paris, but still the revolution is there. And we'll talk about mobile broadband as a fertile ground for social media, disinformation, populists, and so on. This is true, and we show that in our research in Europe. But we also show that in non-democratic countries, especially where censorship of traditional media is widespread, the spread of mobile broadband internet makes corruption more visible, governments more accountable, and that also contributes to development. And in that sense, there is another source of optimism there. And this is something which is very, very recent and which is going on as we speak. If you, any other question? So if not, we can move to closing remarks, which are scheduled to be given by Joel and Arantxa. Thank you.
I don't know what you think, Joel, but I don't think we can put these folks to torture for yet another long 40-minute speech. On my side, to thank you and your colleagues, to thank Frank and everyone who came from Washington, to thank the speakers, who, especially those that are still in the room, who have devoted a big part of their time to closing this asymmetry that the session started with. I think there is a very clear asymmetry, and the asymmetry, as I see it, is that in Europe we are consumed with what's happening in the US, but I'm not sure in the US people are consumed, and institutions are consumed about what's happening in Europe. And yet, we know that this alliance is a huge comparative advantage to both of us. So the challenge, as I see it, is maybe to keep what we've started today. It was a nice, starting attempt at building a bit of work that would help close this asymmetry, build more interest in the US on Europe, and in Europe, build more capacity to help close the gap. So as far as I can see, Joel, maybe we are onto a good start. Maybe we think of what the next iteration of this event could look like, what we learned from this one that would maybe help us in the next iteration, which I think would be extremely valuable, especially because when we do this next year, we may have also a bit of change in circumstances that would perhaps warrant even more as stakeholders of the transatlantic relation and committed internationalists to maybe work a little bit more deep on these issues.
Well, I can say in certain scenarios, my purpose in being here is to try to measure any empty office space you might have here at Sciences Po for those of us who might be sort of seeking refuge from a very difficult environment. But no, what I do want to thank all of you, thank Sciences Po, thank Arantxa, thank Sergey for the cooperation. What we want to get out of this is to encourage the dialogue that our two institutions are devoted to. That was an important part of the intellectual and human exchange for so much of our history, and which have actually, as you rightly point out, now a real asymmetry in terms of in terms of dialogue and engagement. And I think what we would like to do is look for new ways of students to get together and share their ideas, to cooperate, to debate, to raise awareness of different perspectives on these issues. So it's one thing for us to get together among those who are experts in these areas and talk and engage. I think it's even more important to build on that for thinking about more ways of students interacting talking, getting dialogue, whether it's using some of these new technologies to encourage that dialogue, whether it's bringing more people together in different ways. And so I hope this is the start of thinking about what more we can do to build that relationship. So I thank you for working with us. And we'd love to have you over to our place as a next iteration, and bring some students with you, and come also in the beautiful spring when things are in bloom, just like they are here in April in Paris. So we hope to see you again soon. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you all.